Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Strategy Skills Podcast by Firms Consulting. So, in most episodes, we talk about general strategy. We talk about how to analyze problems, what are the big issues facing companies, sectors, CEOs, general managers, leaders across the world. We tackle it from different sides, whether it's organizational design, whether it's digital, and so on. But sometimes it's worth stepping back and understanding the issues facing the individuals who have to react to these waves of change. And today I want to speak to Gorick Ng, who is a research associate at the Harvard Business School, where he looks at managing the future of work. It's a project and initiative funded by the Harvard Business School. But he's also a talent management and workforce development coach, who, in simple terms, provides career coaching and advice primarily to first-generation and low-income students. Now, Gorick has quite an interesting career. He was a BCG consultant. I think he was also an investment banker at Credit Suisse, and he worked for the government of Ontario and so on. So he's got quite a wide range of expertise. And what we're going to talk about today is some of his recent work, whereby he's tied together all of this to provide career advice that you don't necessarily easily find, but there's the things you should be hearing before you get into the workforce. A lot of the thinking, a lot of the ideas are very similar to what we teach, so I think it's going to be very complementary to our listeners. I hope you find it interesting. I found his work, and in particular his latest book, quite interesting to read. As always, hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, Gorick.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you've got a pretty interesting background, right? But I want to start with the fact that you mentioned your mom in your recent book. And I mean, that was just quite an interesting story. So maybe tell me a little bit about your childhood, your mom and how you grew up.
Sounds good. It is atypical to find a business book that starts at early childhood at the age of 14. So I can see where you're coming from. So my background is that I'm a first generation low income college student, meaning that I was the first in my family to pursue higher education. And also coming from a lower income background. So I'm the son of a working class single mother who dropped out of school when she was 12 years old to support her brothers through school. Wow. And when I was 14 years old, I learned to write my first resume. My first resume wasn't for myself, however. It was from my mother when she was laid off from the sewing machine factory job. So as the person in the house who knew how to use the internet and get online, I became responsible for spending recesses learning to write resumes and cover letters, afternoons at the public library, looking for jobs, and evenings coaching my mom. And it was through that experience that I realized that there are so many things that you don't learn from Google or from the public library for that matter. These are rules that are unspoken about how to get ahead that some people know and that many people don't know. And in that particular experience, what happened was we applied to hundreds of jobs and had no callbacks. We had no idea why.
So this was for your mom, right? So I'm guessing this was a long time ago. She wasn't in the computer industry. She didn't know how to use the internet and so on. You had to help her navigate everything. I'm guessing it was her first resume. Is it a fair guess?
It was my first resume.
And it was her first resume as well, I'm guessing.
It was her first resume as well.
So you talk a little bit about low income background, right? Do you feel that the challenges were magnified by that?
At the time, I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yes,
so I wouldn't have been able to necessarily.
Yeah.
What's that?
You just felt your experience was normal at that time.
Exactly. So I felt like life was just difficult and that's just how things are. It wasn't until later on when I was lucky enough to have gotten into Harvard for my undergraduate education that I realized that there's a big disparity between the insiders who know and the outsiders who don't know.
Yes.
And those who've been through the process before of applying to a job, of showing up to a job interview, of knowing what to say, who to say it to, and when to say it, that's when I realized, wow, there's actually much more to these processes than what's written on these job application portals.
So did your mom eventually get a job?
She did, but it wasn't through our efforts, regrettably. So she went back to school through a government grant and became an early childcare assistant.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
We were able to get out of that experience, and it was because we didn't get out of it successfully through our own efforts.
Yes.
That experience ended up sticking with me, because for years afterwards, I kept wondering, how could I, as someone who was proficient at Google, not able to
Yeah.
help her.
Yeah. So you come from a trying background. So how did you make that transition into Harvard? You must have learned a few tricks along the way.
And gotten lucky along the way as well.
And gotten lucky, yes, a combination.
So it was a series of people who pulled me up, I would say.
Yeah.
In elementary school, I had an 8th grade teacher who saw potential in me and encouraged me to apply to, in the US, it's called a magnet program. Essentially, it's a specialized high school program focused on the maths and sciences.
Okay.
He encouraged me to apply to that program, which brought me to a school that was outside of my normal district. At that school, I met a number of students who were involved in student council, and so got involved there. Through a student council event, the president of the student council saw potential in me, and so encouraged me to show up at a conference that was citywide.
Mm-hmm.
At that citywide conference, I met a friend that I talk about in my book named Sandy, who had applied to some of America's top colleges.
Wait, Sandy is a real person in your book?
Sandy is a real person.
Because that name appears a lot. So you obviously have good memories of Sandy.
And we're still in touch.
Wow. So clearly a pattern of people identifying potential. And as you say, that's the luck part, because if they don't see the potential, you kind of fall through the cracks, right?
That's exactly right. And we can very quickly get into a debate about nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
Obviously an age-old debate.
Yes.
But I very much did have people who saw potential in me, encouraged me, and lifted me up. And that's what I aspire to be doing now that I have this newfound privilege.
When I was reading your book, I noticed you used some terminology I hadn't seen before, often in books. The first one that struck me was you used the term first generation executives who are living in the United States and working.
Yeah.
It's very rare to hear someone use that, because typically most business books are not written for that audience. So it's just quite refreshing to see that.
The notion of first generation is also something that I only learned afterwards.
Yes.
It's a relatively recent term that actually started in higher education, where if you're a first generation college student, you're the first in your family to pursue a 4-year degree. Mm-hmm. And there's now a notion of a first generation professional who is someone who's the first in their family to work in a white collar environment. And that's in many ways the audience that I hope to speak to in this book.
Yes. And I'm guessing it's drawing on your own personal experience. I mean, when I was reading the stories, I can imagine you going through those experiences, sending emails at 3 a.m. and getting people to come back to you, right? So let's just step out of the book for a second and talk about how this links to your work you're doing at Harvard, because I'm guessing they're interrelated, inspired or complementary in some way.
Absolutely. I'm wearing a few hats at the moment at Harvard. I am a career advisor at Harvard College, where I specialize in advising first-generation low-income college students in terms of figuring out which courses to take, which majors to pursue, what internships to get, how to navigate to a job offer, how to negotiate their salaries, and then how to succeed in their internships and first jobs out of school. That's one hat I wear at Harvard. Yeah. The other is I'm a researcher with the Managing the Future of Work project at Harvard Business School. And at the same time, I'm writing this book. So
the book is inspired by the work you're doing at Harvard and your past experiences. It's based on things you've seen other students experience. Is that the motivation for the book? So the motivation came from both the head and the heart. Okay. So I'll start with the heart because I think that's the basis of so much of this. Over the course of growing up, I started realizing that, again, to this notion of unspoken rules, there are a set of unspoken rules to getting into an institution of higher education. There are unspoken rules to getting into a job. And then once I got into a job, I realized that there were a host of unspoken rules on how to survive and thrive as a professional. Yes. And as someone who had never seen this corporate environment before, I saw this disparity between folks like me and folks whose parents were vice presidents, board members who'd been there and done that. And it was then that I started realizing that there was this disparity between these insiders and outsiders. That's where it came from the heart. And when I returned to Harvard as an MBA student and then as a career advisor, what I started realizing was that there was actually a disparity that I hadn't recognized when I was in the position as a student, but that I was seeing more and more as an advisor, where there's this notion that we don't know what we don't know. Yes. That's true for all of us. But there are a certain set of things that one can do in college to be able to set oneself up for a fulfilling career and a high-paying career and a
an upwardly mobile career. And some students will come into college already having an idea of which internships they want to pursue, which clubs and activities they want to pursue, which professors they want to build relationships with. And then there were others, and still others, who really don't know how to navigate that system. And so when it comes to the heart motivation, what I wanted to do was to pay it forward. Now that I've had a chance to be at least a few steps further along than students who are currently in school, I wanted to be able to pass down some of that knowledge that I wish someone could have handed to me. So that's where it came from when it came to the heart. And then when it came to the head, I was an associate at the Boston Consulting Group. And it was in that experience that I noticed that so much of my learning happened through trial and error. Yeah. And this was despite being at BCG, a firm that is world-class in its learning and development and onboarding and training. And when I started pulling late nights, getting stressed, not being able to meet my deadlines, I started wondering, why was life so hard? Again, it was as if I had experienced I was watching the same movie that I had watched when I was 14 years old and writing that first resume. But now I was in the corporate world and I was facing it firsthand. What I did at that point was I started speaking with coworkers at first, and then friends of mine who were working at other companies to understand, was it just me who was struggling so much in my first job, or was this something that other people were experiencing as well? And what I started realizing was that it was a tough experience for everyone, which then prompted me to wonder, well, if that's the case at world-class organizations, what does that say about anyone who's joining a small, medium-sized business, the public sector, nonprofits, where there may not even be an HR department or learning and development or training or onboarding? And so what I wanted to do was to bottle up so much of this tacit knowledge that one accumulates through trial and error and life experience, put it into a single resource that we can then scale beyond the four walls of a place like BCG, so that companies that don't even have the training can get their new hires up to speed more quickly. That's the head motivation behind this effort.
So, I mean, I like the stories. One thing I liked about the book is how practical the tools and templates were. By the way, did you do the animation?
I took out napkins, took out a black pen, and I doodled on them. And they got converted into images by the publishing team.
Okay, it's a very good job because it makes it very accessible, right? So let's just step back into the details of the book, right? The book is very, very practical in terms of how to do X, how to do Y, as opposed to, laying out grand strategies and grand theories of how to do things, which is good as well. I mean, there's a time and place for all those things. Do you feel that the book is fixing a gap that the university should be covering?
In many ways, yes. If I could wave a magic wand, I would want to make higher education and the education system at large much more practical. That's not to say that the liberal arts don't matter. I think we can have a healthy debate here and conversation here about what is the purpose of education to help people think. But at the same time, there are a whole host of things that school doesn't teach, but that the real world expects of us, whether it's financial literacy, whether it's soft skills, whether it's navigational skills of how to deal with ambiguity and come upon answers yourself when there isn't a clear-cut solution. These are things that I believe our education system should be teaching, but that aren't teaching right now, and that I would love for my book to be a part of the formal curriculum.
Yeah, one thing I liked about your book is when dealing with associates and all levels, actually, at McKinsey and BCG, even Bain, there is almost an expectation amongst consultants, and I'm using those three as an example, but I assume it applies to other firms as well, that when people go to good schools, like Harvard and many other good schools around the world, there's almost an expectation when they join these firms, they're on a conveyor belt. And that conveyor belt is going to get them to little touch points where they check in and it leads them to a promotion. But they're unable to distinguish between being accountable and being responsible, as you say in the book, owning the problem versus owning the solution. But do you feel that is something that's almost a mindset change? What advice would you give for people in adopting that mindset? Because there's always a danger they'll just go through the checklist, but they don't know why they're doing it, right?
It's a great point, and I would encourage people to think about all the moments in our everyday lives where we're taking ownership of a situation ourselves.
Yes.
One example I can think about is going from A to B and, let's say, taking the bus, or I guess to use a more consultant relatable case would be taking a flight.
Yeah.
If you're trying to, let's say, go from Toronto to Los Angeles, you have to take a series of steps independently in order to make sure you get there on time.
Yeah.
You need to figure out when that flight is departing. You need to check the weather to make sure that it's departing on time. You need to check the traffic to make sure that you're getting into your Uber or public transit accordingly. You need to make sure you pack your bags. You need to make sure that whatever you put in that bag is able to be brought onto the flight. You need to make sure that your luggage is under the weight limits. You need to make sure that you bring your passport and photo ID and all of those things. So in all of those situations, the way that I think about it is you own the situation. That's to say that if you don't solve all of these problems yourself, no one will solve them for you. And you'll get stranded at the airport. You won't have an extra pair of underwear, et cetera. This is one of those situations that we all have gone through where we're taking ownership. But for some reason, when it comes to the workplace, especially among early career professionals, something about school prompts us to switch that ownership mindset off, where when we go into the workplace, we assume that the workplace is a continuation of school, that just like school, we can wait for the next assignment, that the assignment will have clear expectations, that all we need to do is fill in the blanks or find 5 sources to write this paper if that's what the criteria says. Where that may have been the case in school, and that may have been what's required to succeed in school, but what's required to succeed in the workplace is that ownership mindset that you have in going to the airport. The only thing is that people don't tell you this. And so the feedback comes in the form of getting yelled at, of doing things incorrectly, of not getting promoted, when really we should be having this conversation much more clearly up front, because we all have that capacity. It's just that we have somehow switched it off over the course of our 16 years sitting in a lecture hall trying to stay awake.
Let's unpack this, because I think this is sort of the centerpiece on which your entire book sits, right? It's this concept of owning things and being accountable. So when I was a partner, I remember that the best consultants were always the ones whereby if I sent them an email to do something, they would figure it out, versus the ones who would come to me with a notebook and a pencil and want me to tell them what to do. And I obviously don't know what to do because they are more closer to the details than I am, right? I just know I need something, but they've got to figure it out. So how do everything you're saying is very well said, very logical, and I agree with you. But don't you feel there's almost a situation in life whereby when people get educated, they feel as if there's nothing more they need to do to be successful. They feel that I've got the degree now. I've joined, in this case, BCG, in your case, but everything else is going to fall into pieces. So how do we get people listening to this to change? And I'll give you an example of this, right? I speak to a lot of people about this, all the way from business analyst level up to partner level, because partners also have these problems as well, because once you get to a partnership level, you're competing with other partners. You have to bring in a certain amount of business. You have a performance review every 2 years and so on, right? And these are very smart people, but they all somehow think they're already owning the problem. And I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated for you now. I think there's also a confidence issue here, whereby if you're first generation, you don't know if what you're doing to take ownership is going to make you more of an outlier, and you don't want to be an outlier. So as an example, in your situation, I'm guessing there weren't many people of your ethnicity and heritage, first generation at the firm, that knew what you were going through, right? So what's your experience? What do you think works best in making this second nature?
You actually touched upon 2 that I would love to unpack, which is there's a piece that's related to confidence, and then there's a piece that's related to the conditioning that we've gone through education. Let me start with the second one first, where the first 16 years of our education, if you're going into a college or a university, is very much a conveyor belt. You use this term yourself, where if you do well in 4th grade, you'll get promoted to 5th grade. And if you do well in 5th grade, you'll do well in you'll get promoted to 6th grade. And the way that you do well is by keeping up. Yeah. So not procrastinating, making sure that you get your assignments in on time, making sure that you're prepared for the next assignment, or rather test. Really, it's just about keeping up. Mm-hmm. And when you have 16 years of that level of conditioning and no one tells you that life should be lived in any other way, I don't blame anyone coming out of school for not having that ownership mindset. One thing I will say about the confidence piece, which I think is an important layer and is a dialogue that I think we should be having more of, which is that I think some of this is certainly a function of socioeconomic background. It's also a matter of culture in some ways as well, because the idea of taking ownership of a problem requires confronting an elder, requires confronting someone who has many years, sometimes decades more experience than you do, someone who knows more than you do, speaks more confidently than you do, and who has a say in your performance evaluation. So imagine coming out of school at the age of, let's say, 22, and having a 50-year-old partner tell you to do something. It's hard to say no. It's hard to say, actually, I think we should be trying it this way. Or I see your thinking, but I was thinking about this approach instead. Or I'm able to do this by this deadline, but I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to do everything. What about this piece instead? Because I feel like this piece is the most important portion of this work stream. That level of pushing back upon authority isn't something that's ingrained within every culture. It's certainly a very American construct to call elders by their first names, to push back upon authority, to speak up in meetings. And that's not how everyone was raised. And that's not to say that one way is better than the other. It's just it's a matter of a different level of upbringing.
It's a very good point, because people from all over the world are going to be listening to this podcast. We have listeners all over the world. But the advice you're given, which I think is universal, I think it'll be applicable to anyone, anywhere in the world. It's about integrating into American businesses, right? Because I can see someone trying to do this in some Asian countries where this culture is not, I wouldn't say normal, but is not common, and getting an enormous amount of pushback and being called arrogant, right? Or being disrespectful. So confidence is not just a function of self-belief. It's a function of self-awareness as well. You have to know where you are and which of these, I'll call them tools that you've given people. You've got to know which one to use, right? But as someone who's 22 years old, as you rightfully say, it's very difficult to push back, right? It's not just about pushing back. It's about, maybe that's not the best word. It's about owning what's happening and taking away some of the burden from the senior person. Maybe it's a better way of saying it. But you're 22 years old, you're at a firm like BCG, which is maybe going to manage you out in 2 years if you don't toe the line. What advice do you have for someone who is so scared they're not going to make it, but at the same time, they've got to put themselves out there when they're trying to hide? It's a very difficult balancing act. What do you think works?
It very much is a balancing act. And in my book, I talk about how I have a framework that I call the 3 C's. And in this case, let's talk about competence as one of those 3 C's, where there's a invisible range that we're all navigating, where you want to stay in the sweet spot of the zone of competence.
Yes.
Overshoot and you become overbearing. Undershoot and you become clueless. And where that zone of competence sits will depend on the working culture you're in, the expectations of your coworkers, and it's your job as a new hire in a different working culture to be able to determine for yourself where that invisible zone is. Where you're right, if you're working in a culture that's more deferential to authority, you may want to tone down some of these tactics. Where there might be more of a flat hierarchy, let's say in a startup environment, especially an American startup environment, you may want to dial up some of that ownership.
Yes.
What I would say is these are principles that I'd like to think are universal. The extent of these tactics will depend on the reader and their own diagnosis of the situation.
Also, maybe just to dig in there more, because I think people want to know more about this. We've got to distinguish between the appearance of confidence and being confident. Because a lot of times you see someone speak in a certain way, act in a certain way, and you think they're confident, but they're not confident. At other times, you see someone who's very differential, very quiet, sitting in the corner, taking a lot of notes, not saying anything, but they're able to do things that you wouldn't assume of someone who lacks confidence could do. So when we talk about confidence, it's something that we think we know what is confidence because of the way someone acts. But at the end of the day, we have to watch their behavior to see whether they actually get things done, whether they take ownership. Because Americans are very visual. We look at someone that acts in a certain way, stands in a certain way, walks in a room in a certain way, and we say, wow, that's a confident leader. Let's follow him or her, right? And then we watch other cultures and we tend to sometimes misread the signals. And we think this person's not confident until we see what they do a few months, years later, and we realize they actually knew exactly what they were doing. So how much of confidence comes from it being a feeling versus accomplishing things? Because it seems as if everyone wants to feel confident, but that doesn't actually get you anything. You actually have to do something, right?
Absolutely. One of the concepts that I think some people take a lifetime to figure out is the difference between confidence and competence. And they may sound similar, but they're very different in definition, where competence is what you know and what you're capable of. Confidence is your belief in your ability to do that thing. And when it comes to, for example, let's say building a financial model at work, you may have the ability to do it, but you also need to have the self-talk with yourself that actually I have the skill to do this as well. And teaching confidence is not easy. I will not pretend to be able to provide the playbook to that, although I do make an attempt in my book to teach people to be confident, at least with anecdotes of others who've been able to navigate this. But confidence does require a certain level of self-talk and self-belief. And in my book, I talk a bit about anecdotes of others who've acquired confidence along the way. One example is someone who looked back at her college experience and simply gave credit to herself for all of the progress that she's made. So in her English class, she got her first paper back in her first college class and got a terrible grade. In that situation, you have one of two options. You can either treat that as a fact of life, or you can try and fix the situation. In her case, she went up to the professor, said, "Tell me all the things that I'm doing wrong. I'm going to fix it." And fast forward to the end of the semester, and this person ended up getting the highest grade in that class. Fast forward several more years when she ended up in her internship, she ended up looking back at that experience and thinking to herself, "Oh yeah, actually, I really was able to improve. And I was able to improve because I put in the hard work, because I asked for help, because I persisted." And so one of these ingredients is to just take stock of all that you've been through in life. And we all have those experiences. Take stock of what you've been able to accomplish, because it's no small feat. We just need to give ourselves credit, is one piece. The second piece is to know that higher ups don't necessarily know what they're talking about either. I think this is one of the things that many consultants realize sooner or later, is that just because a partner in a room or an executive in a room sounds sure of themselves doesn't necessarily mean they really are sure, or even if they are sure, that they have the right answer.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think a consulting job is really great at is exposure to senior people, where over time you start having this pattern recognition of, oh, wow, this person may have this fancy title. This person may be very high paid. This person may have a lot of experience, but in the end, no one has it figured out. And if that's true at the senior levels, that should give all of us permission at the junior levels to take more risk, to speak up more, and to at least give ourselves credit for what we do know.
Yes. I mean, everything you're saying is very true. It's almost as if we need to teach people that it's okay to fail. You don't have to worry about being punished. It's a learning. You got to step back, self-reflect, like that example, that nice example of that lady you mentioned who asked a professor, what can she do to improve? But the reality is that for a subgroup of the population, there's fear, shame, and humiliation. They never want to look at this again. They want to bury it as far as they can. And then they move to the next opportunity, not using this as a learning moment. You know, I read somewhere, and I'm not sure of the exact numbers, so I may be a little bit off on this, but I think it's one of the Scandinavian countries, Norway, I think it is, whereby for certain sports, they don't grade people and don't give them prizes until they get to about 11 or 12 years old. Because the feeling there is they need to teach them to have fun first. And your screen is back. They want to teach them to have fun first. Only once they learn the concepts of teamwork and how to work together, then they start grading them on their performance. But how do we then start teaching people to be more self-aware, whereby they're willing and able to step back and not punish themselves and worry so much about these things? Because we're in a world where it's very competitive. COVID is not helping with the unemployment tanking and so on. Like, people are scared. So it's almost someone needs to constantly sit down with them and say, it's okay, you've got to step back, you've got to think about things. I mean, you do that often in your job as a career counselor, right?
I do. And I would say that if we come back to the idea of what our education system is lacking in,
Yes.
It's in exactly what we've just talked about for this entire conversation so far. I would say that a lot of I would say that so much of this confidence building outside is happening outside of the classroom.
Yes.
And it's being outsourced to extracurricular activities where if you are part of a student council, if you're a part of a cultural group, if you're in a sports team, really it's those arenas that you learn how to fail and to fail in a safe way. It's in those arenas that you learn how to lead your peers, how to navigate ambiguity, how to set goals and get yourself from here to there. That's not something that our formal education system offers. It's outsourced at the moment. And so I do very much see a great deal of merit in many companies looking at people's resumes and saying, okay, you've done well enough in these standardized tests or in the case interview or in your academic coursework, but let's take a look at all the non-academic stuff, because really that's probably going to be where you learned most of your life lessons that will carry you forward to becoming a successful professional.
Yes. And, I'm sure you see this a lot, whereby even though you counsel people that they can learn all these valuable skills in non-academics, leadership, teamwork, and so on, but at the end of the day, a lot of people just tick the boxes. They do it to get it done and put it on their resume versus making it a true learning experience. And it's a question of teaching people that all the skills you need to be successful, you mentioned the 3C model, commitment, competence, and so on. You don't get all of that from education. You get just a little part of that, and you've got to balance it off, right? And the challenge is always that if you don't create a lifestyle whereby you're constantly learning and adjusting when you're young, it's very hard to do that once you get older. I've dealt with clients who, like yourself, very accomplished first generation, had to work hard their entire life, some of them part-time jobs and so on. And then when they start working, they don't know how to change their lifestyle. So they stick with the same lifestyle, but they don't socialize with colleagues because socializing never rewarded them before. And then, as you say in the book, they miss out on key opportunities. And they don't know why, because they're doing the work, they're there till 2 a.m. every morning, but they don't know about a role that opened up because they never went to drink beer on Friday. And it's how do you make that transition? Because it's difficult, because on the one hand, this from personal experience, you're afraid of leaving what worked, but at the same time, what worked is not working now. And the last thing you want to do when you're not getting promoted is go to drink beer with your friends on a Friday. So how do you make that transition?
Yeah, let me answer this in two ways. The first is that I would say it's a gradual journey. We're currently in a world where so many of these unspoken rules are still unspoken.
Yeah.
And in my humble opinion, I think a big step forward is to simply start writing down and talking about these unspoken rules in the case of socializing with your coworkers and its importance to getting promoted. Once we start talking about what is otherwise unspoken, but recognized and very much a part of the system, I hope that those who didn't know what they didn't know, at least now know what they didn't know. And that's really step one. Once we get into people knowing that these are the unspoken rules, where the unspoken becomes the spoken and the unwritten become the written, then it's very much a matter of, there's an element of personal responsibility. And then there's also an element of what can managers and business leaders do to create cultures where everyone has an equal chance at succeeding. So in the case of personal responsibility, there's an element where we're making this imperfect system slightly more meritocratic by laying out these unspoken rules, where maybe what separates people now isn't so much about merit, it's about personal motivation. How badly do you want it? Now, I'm not saying that personal responsibility is the end all be all, because there are limits to that, and managers and leaders have a role to play. And that's where we move into that element, where when it comes to firm cultures that revolve around promotion based on compatibility versus promotion based on competence, I would love for business leaders to take a cold, hard look at how they're promoting people. In my book, I talk about an accounting firm where the partners and the senior managers all sit around the table and discuss who they should be promoting, who is considered at the top level, sort of mediocre, sort of average, and then who are underperformers. And what they realized was that the people who were getting promoted weren't necessarily the most competent. They were the most outgoing. They were the most competent at putting themselves out there.
Yeah.
So I hope that business leaders can take a look at how they're doing things. And only once we have the marriage of personal responsibility on both the individual and on the system level, can we really have, I think, the change that we want to see. When it comes to the idea of how do we get this into people's heads, I think that's where we start getting into the cultural piece of the American way of business, of conducting business isn't necessarily the right way. And who's to say what is the right or wrong way? I think it just takes that dialogue for us to get to a better place where people can thrive.
Yeah, so everything we're talking about is how people can be their best selves, right? How do we eliminate those barriers of misunderstanding, lack of confidence, lack of awareness? It's about doing the best work you can do, assuming all those taxes were removed. But it's a very complicated thing, because I remember when I was starting off, I used to sit in a space where one of the strategy partners used to sit. And I got to know the guy. And I used to see what clothing he was wearing. Then I'd buy the same clothing, right? I'd listen to how he ran his telephone calls, how he ran his meetings. And you just start mimicking it because you see it as best practice. So location plays a big role. Not just whether you're in a social meeting, but whether you have access to observe these people. We don't talk about that enough, but I'm sure if I set up 30-minute meetings with him once a week, I would have learned far less than just watching him in his native environment. When a client calls and he's not so happy with him, how diplomatic the guy is, how he de-escalates things, how he talks to people, the words he uses, and so on. And one of the things that I thought was interesting in your book is that at no point did you advocate a training program. It was all about, everything you learned was about watching someone or working with someone. One of my friends, Bill Mattisoni, always says that if you want to create the best pricing consultant, you don't send him to a pricing program run by BCG. You put him on 3 pricing studies. And at the end, he'll be the best. So the question I want to ask you, and it's maybe a bit of an unfair question, is it seems it's a function of opportunity. We can say all these things and we can have all these programs and we can have as many scholarships as we want, sending as many kids as we want to university. But if there's no opportunity for them to work with someone so they can observe, it's all going to come down to a very slow process of change.
Absolutely. There's no replacement for life experience and being able to see it with your own eyes and experience it with your own body. And so we're talking about the shortcomings of the education system. We also need to recognize that the education system currently isn't set up to do so much of this experiential learning. We can have a conversation about whether we should have more experiential learning. My vote is for yes, but I think that's a separate conversation. When it comes to life experience, you're absolutely correct. And I would say this in 2 life stages: early childhood and early adulthood. So in the case of early childhood, and the reason why I start my book with my childhood upbringing of writing my resume and cover letter for my mother, is because I wasn't having the dinner time conversations that someone whose parents are vice presidents or board members at large corporations would be having over the dinner table, which would be a very different set of conversations revolving perhaps around the Wall Street Journal, what's happening in the markets, what types of clients they had to deal with, and what types of conflict they had to manage. Those weren't the types of conversations I had growing up, and that students from my background wouldn't have had growing up, because they just didn't have parents and mentors who were well-versed in these white-collar environments. So the idea of getting young people to be exposed to more careers paths of ways of working, I think is a beneficial thing. I would love to see more opportunities for young people to be able to see different workplaces, to meet different types of professionals. This is veering into a slightly different conversation, but I think we very quickly move into goal setting and career pathing as well, where right now, the way that so many people are introduced to career education is by filling out a survey that asks, do you like working with numbers? Do you like working with people? Do you like the outdoors? And then it spits out, oh, you should be a camp counselor or you should be a firefighter. That may work from an algorithmic perspective, but it really doesn't work, in my personal opinion, when it comes to really introducing young people to the range of career paths that are available. What I'll also say is, if your parents grew up if your parents were, for example, doctors, I see this at Harvard all the time, where if your parents were doctors, often these students come into college asking themselves, what else could I do outside of medicine? So medicine becomes the status quo, and their goal is to find out what else is out there that's better than medicine, which is a very different mindset and conversation that students whose parents were, for example, overnight security guards would have had. And we, again, coming back to this idea of we don't know what we don't know, if you've never been exposed to someone who has won a court case before, who has worn a white coat before, it's very difficult to have the confidence to see yourself in that position and to see yourself and to even know what it takes to get there. So that's the early childhood piece. When it comes to later, not really later, but I guess emerging adulthood and after college, one of the things that I admire about the consulting firms is their capacity to take young people who, just by definition, as a function of their age, don't have very much work experience and put them into a variety of uncomfortable business settings across a range of geographies, industries, and job types, and to give them that trial by fire before letting them out into the world after the finishing school of consulting. And so there is actually a valuable education that consultants get, and that many of these rotational programs and professional services firms offer that I think leads to a steeper pace of growth, and that lead to people having a better sense of self. When it comes to my book and my personal mission, what I would love to be able to do is to scale this level of training. And that's why I actually wrote this book. This comes back to the head motivation, is what if we could bottle up the training that you would get that's currently locked inside of a certain set of companies and industries and democratize that to the world? What if any company can be a training organization? What if every company can be a place where you can learn the ropes to becoming a professional, so that even though your first job may be difficult, your second job will be that much easier and you'll be putting yourself on the path to success?
One of the things that we've been talking about is when I read the book, I did not see it as a book only for young people. We spoke a lot about young people, but I don't see it as a book for young people only. I think that one of the things that it's a common mistake that everyone makes is to think it's just young people that need to learn these things, just young people that lack the confidence. It's just young people that lack opportunity, right? Lack of opportunity, lack of role models, it's a function of socioeconomics. So when I was reading it, I was thinking there are quite a lot of, actually, I would say there's a lot of senior people, middle-level management people that don't know they have permission to do these things. No one's told them, you know what, you can do this. You can speak up. You can take control. You can set the agenda for a meeting. You can advise your immediate superior on how something can be done if it's for the best interest of the company, right? So we spoke a lot about kids and college students, but I didn't see it as a college student book.
I appreciate you saying that. It's music to my ears. We certainly see the disparity at the senior levels as well, where you have disparities around who gets promoted to management. And in the US, there have been studies that have shown that Asian Americans actually are promoted at the lowest rates of all ethnic minorities. And this is beyond the entry levels. This is now mid-level management level. And then once we get into the C-suite, we get into glass ceilings, bamboo ceilings. There are a bunch of metaphors for various cultures and ethnic backgrounds. So absolutely, I think this is a conversation that should be having not just at the entry level, but at the later career level. A quote that I heard over the course of my research that has very much stuck with me is the idea that what is a must for some is good for all, which is to say that this book, in my humble opinion, is a must for young people, but it's beneficial to everyone. And I would say even for managers, when they think about how can I delegate better and how do I manage my team more efficiently?
Yeah, that was very good at teaching people how to communicate, because you gave them how to write an email, how to ask for help, how to send an email to help someone. And that's the basics of communication, which many people don't know how to do, and they miss out on some major opportunities. And you had some good examples of miscommunication there, right? You touched on some points here, which I think are quite interesting to bring up. I remember reading I think it was New York Times article recently, and it listed the different ethnic groups in America by income level. And I was very surprised to see Asians at the bottom, because a lot of times what we do is we forget about the income disparity in the group. We know of highly educated Asians, different minorities, and so on. But we also tend to, the point I'm trying to get to is that there are stereotypes covering each minority. And what I find is my experience of working with clients, you've got to help them navigate those stereotypes. Because I've had clients who just by the fact that they belong to a certain ethnic group, it's almost expected they'll be successful. And because they're expected they'll be successful, things are stacked up against them. And they don't even know this. I remember I'm not going to mention the countries, but I was telling someone from one Southeast Asian country, you do realize if you interview for the consulting firm office in this country, one of the biggest things you have to overcome is the fact that people in this country look down on people in your country. And it's a fact. It's one of those unspoken rules, right? There are many of these unspoken rules. Either we don't want to talk about it, it's not politically correct, but it's there. And it's almost another hurdle. People listening to this and say, but Michael, you and Gorick are telling me I've got to learn how to communicate, I've got to learn how to socialize. And now you're telling me there could be something about my ethnicity and my background that's another hurdle, but it's a fact, right? We have to deal with these things.
Absolutely. And it's regrettable that that's the case. And I address it through one of my 20 unspoken rules in my book, which is know your context and know your audience.
Yeah.
Which is to say that when we enter into a workplace setting, it's important to recognize, am I in the majority or the minority? Am I more introverted or extroverted? Am I more experienced or not? Am I older or younger? These are all considerations that even if you don't consider, your coworkers will be considering. Because if you're the youngest person in the room, or you're the only woman in a male-dominated work environment, or you are working in a profession that may be against your racial or ethnic or gender stereotypes, whether you like it or not, regrettably, your coworkers will have preconceptions towards what you're good at, what you're not good at, what they can trust you with, what they cannot trust you with. And it's, again, there's this idea of to what extent is it personal responsibility and to what extent is it a collective mission that we should all be driving towards. As a how-to guide, I provide tactics on how to navigate these situations if you find yourself being in the minority, if you find yourself being slightly more soft-spoken than your coworkers, how do you speak up anyways? How do you at least be heard even if you're not speaking up? But again, we move into the culture building area of the book where I can only hope that leaders will pick up this book and realize that there are certain things that they're doing unintentionally that are holding some of their teammates back.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this is that everyone's going to experience it at some point in their life. I remember speaking to a partner at McKinsey once, and he was talking about his background. I asked him, but why did you experience these things? And he said, don't you know I'm Irish? I'm thinking, I don't know what an Irish person looks like from a Norwegian person, right? But to him, he actually felt that because of his Irish heritage, he was treated differently. So here's a guy that anyone looking at him would think, wow, you've got everything made for you, right? But he's experiencing some kind of turmoil and differences and so on. But my advice for people, and I don't know what you would say about this, is to be constructive in dealing with these things. Always look at things from the side of the other party and realize there's always misunderstandings as opposed to just negative intent. And I've had experiences as well. And I always find that when you get to know someone and you humanize them, they tend to reflect that and everything works from there. It's not easy, I know that, but it's better to start from that viewpoint.
Yeah, I think life is a much more interesting and fulfilling experience when you assume positive intent than negative intent.
Yes, that's true, because usually it's a lot of misunderstandings, right? What's next for you in getting your message out? Because you've got a good idea, some good concepts. I like it personally, very similar to some of the things we teach. But how do you get the message out? The book's great, but people are inundated with so many things. So what is the best mechanism? What are the avenues you're using? Is it part of your teaching, or how are you gonna get it out?
This very quickly becomes a case interview on its own, where the case interview is this a B2B venture or a B2C venture?
Yeah.
And there are pros and cons to each of these, where because so much of this is a function of corporate culture and corporate practices, what I'm currently doing is engaging with employers like the professional services firms and really anyone who's hiring on a cohort basis, large volumes of entry-level employees, and helping them better design their onboarding and their training processes. There's a robust enterprise to potentially be built in that space. But what I am truly passionate about, in addition to the culture building aspect, is equipping individuals with the mindsets, habits, skills, tools they need to be able to become better captains of their career. And so there is a B2C element of being on social media so that students who may not be working at the organizations that I'm partnering with still have access to this information and can still bring it into their respective workplace contexts. At the moment, I would say that it's likely an and situation rather than an or situation.
Yeah.
So those listening on the institutional side, hopefully you found this conversation helpful and would like to bring this type of dialogue to your organization. And then for those who are individuals who, whether are self-employed or currently in school, hopefully there's an interaction point between us. I'm on all the social media platforms, but that's very much still an experiment.
When you are interacting with students you are counseling at Harvard, do you see them changing and adopting the principles? I mean, how does it work? What do you think is the best practice rollout here?
That's still very much an experiment right now.
Yeah.
I have been seeing students in my work here at Harvard adopting some of these principles.
Yeah.
And so many of these principles are just as applicable to the job search, which is really where my focus is at Harvard. An idea that I talk about in the book is the notion of leverage, just as an example. Leverage is a fancy way of saying power. Who has the power in a certain situation? So if you are, for example, going on a road trip and your friend is bringing the car and you're tagging along, well, your friend has the leverage because they always have the power to say, actually, you know what? I'm not going to drive. You should drive. In the job search, it's very much an uneven power balance where you as a job seeker are in beggar mode versus chooser mode. So the minute a recruiter reaches out and says, hey, would you like to talk? Let's schedule an interview. Your responsibility as a job seeker is to respond right away, not to sit on that email for 2 weeks, because someone else in that 2-week period will have swooped up the opportunity before you've even had a chance to respond. And so when I teach Harvard students about the notion of leverage and how it's important to diagnose under what circumstances you have leverage and not have leverage, students start behaving very differently, where they're much more proactive in the job search. They're sending thank you emails. They're responding right away. And you really do see a difference in outcomes. Students who had the competence, as in would have done these jobs really well, are highly academically proficient, but didn't know these unspoken rules, sat on that recruiter's email for 2 weeks, and missed out on a job opportunity that they would have been perfectly qualified for, but that they didn't get because they didn't navigate this unspoken rule of leverage.
You know, that's a good example you give in your book, because I remember we once had a client and she was talking to the head of BCG, Hans Paul Berkner, at that time anyway. And she didn't respond to him for a week. And I said, why didn't you respond to him? And she said, I didn't know what to tell him. I mean, it's the CEO of BCG. You don't know what to tell him. And, you know, we actually find that funny because you and I, and a lot of people know that once you meet the head of a company, you don't have to follow protocol. You don't have to worry if there's an opening. He's the CEO, right? He will create an opportunity if he likes you. But I think one of the things we haven't spoken about, and I think we should maybe touch on this as we get to the end, is that, you know, it's very hard to be successful in life. I mean, you know that people work very hard. I mean, your mom worked incredibly hard, right? I read the story. It's difficult, a lot of sacrifices. It's hard. You've got to make a lot of sacrifices. You have to give up a part of your life to decide that I'm going to study and be someone to take care of my family, right? A lot of things that kids do, you're not going to do. It's the same when you go to university. I mean, it's better, but you still have to remain focused. Especially if you're a scholarship child, you know, you have to remain focused, right? Because you have a scholarship writing and everything. And you get your degree and you get into a great firm, whatever the firm is, Morgan Stanley, McKinsey, and so on. And now Gorick and Michael are telling all these people, there's another set of rules you got to master. It can become too much. But I think one of the things I want people to realize is that it's not that difficult. It's not that bad, because it's much worse later than if you're not as successful as you thought you would be and don't know why it happened. And it doesn't matter if you start doing this when you're 22, 27, 35, or 39, because you're going to live your life. Your next 5 years are going to happen. So you might as well go there with a good sort of rules, I think. So I just wanted to make sure that, and I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, is that we're not trying to scare people. We're trying to give them some ideas on how to see those landmines before they get there, right?
One of the shower thoughts I find myself having with myself is the notion of preventative medicine versus a surgery.
Yeah.
And a book like mine is in many ways trying to sell preventative medicine.
Yes. Good. That's a good analogy. I like that.
And it's difficult. I mean, I see this at Harvard with the students that I advise, where some students have that foresight, that desire, that ability to know what they don't know, probably because someone else is whispering in their ear, where they're in the mindset to adopt and to take medicine. Meanwhile, some other students, I wouldn't even say students, but other people may not be as receptive to the idea of preventative medicine and would much rather endure the surgery. Regrettably, I mean, we see this in what sells in the marketplace.
Yes.
Preventative medicine is a hard thing to sell. And
Yes.
so if we can crack the code of how to sell preventative medicine, not only are we going to help people be more successful in their careers, but we'll have a healthier, happier society in all ranges of contexts.
You're trying to sell preventative medicine to Americans. It's going to be a hard sell, Gorick. It's going to be a very hard sell. Gorick, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you here. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap up?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to share my story, to talk about my book. I'm excited to hear from your audience and to hopefully engage with many of them. You'll be able to find me on the different social media accounts and networks, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, even TikTok now. And so hopefully this is the start of the conversation and not the end of the conversation.
Fantastic. With that, let's sign off and we'll be in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. Appreciate your time.
And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the episode. Finally, I want you to remember that the only way to get access to our special offers, the only way to get our special pricing, and the only way to get samples of our content is to join the list on firmsconsulting.com. It's the only way also to get access to our unique advanced content that we make available to insiders. So if you want to get a sneak peek of things, test it out, see what's in there, this is the place to go. And finally, I want to thank you again for making us one of the largest podcast channels around the world for careers and for the 2 million downloads and counting.